Welcome to part 3 of the Age of Progressive Reform. Now we're going to talk about public motherhood. Now, as I mentioned before, women would form a large percentage of these progressive reformers, and so from this we would see the birth or growth of public motherhood, right? Women would see their home as broadened out as their urban community, right? And so they see the conditions that some of these working class kids live in and say, we got to do something about this, right? Women clubs would be formed, and women clubs would spearhead the creation of things like libraries, affordable health care centers, home economic courses for working class mothers, right? You can see this idea, like, for example, middle class women are going to be appalled at the condition that the working class children were left to grow up in. So in 1904, they formed the National Child Labor Committee, which would take the battle against child labor to a national level, right? They would hire a photographer named Lewis Hine, who would document child labor to raise public awareness. And out of that, by 1916, they did have one success, the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act of 1916, which banned interstate commerce of any goods that were produced by child labor, right? So again, like I said, progressivism made inroads in child labor, though they didn't eliminate it, right? But on a grassroots level, you're going to see more successes when it comes to public motherhood, right? Reformers began to see what they could do about the idle time that these working class kids had. And so they spearheaded the creation of things like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts of America, along with playgrounds, right? In 1906, they'll form the Playground Association of America, which in its first 3 years of existence is going to create 1,500 playgrounds across 260 cities in the United States. Playgrounds like this one. Isn't this great? Was your playground this good? Now, I tell you, as a general rule, I find that I am significantly older than the majority of my students, and we did have some pretty dangerous things on our playground, like, for example, the metal slide, that would kind of cook you as you slid down it, right? The seesaw, which was a test on how good of friends you were, right? When that person's high up in the air, do I stay on there or do I hop off and let him plummet to his death? Right? And the merry-go-round, which if you stood in the dead center of it when somebody particularly beefy started spinning it real fast, it was an exercise in physics, right? In centrifugal force. You stay in the middle, you turn in a nice little circle. But if you get a little bit off center, centrifugal force takes place and you become a physics experiment as you go flying off the thing. But we didn't have this. How tall is that? About a 15-foot, I'm assuming that woman's about 5 foot, a 15-foot set of swings. And I know I'd be that kid on the swing on the far right there. There's some plates up there for the top and a ladder so you can get up top and walk across the top of it like a balance beam. The nice thing about this particular playground, I can say for sure, is that if something goes wrong, it's probably going to be a clean kill. Now, the public motherhood movement also led the progressive war on vice, right? An attack on vice in the United States, and particularly 3 institutions, right? The saloons, alcohol, right? Cigarettes, and prostitution. And they would have varying degrees of success. For example, cigarettes and tobacco, they said that cigarettes are just coffin nails, right? They cause health problems. And people knew that even back then, by the way. It wasn't the case that we discovered in the 1950s that cigarettes cause health issues. We knew that the cigarettes and cigars and things like that did, right? But the argument in public motherhood was that cigarettes and tobacco was a gateway drug to harder drugs. It's kind of ironic when you think about the argument that's made about other things as being a gateway drug today, right? Now, they're not going to make very many inroads against tobacco. Matter of fact, we really don't see a big movement against tobacco until the 1990s, right? The second thing, saloons, they're going to have a little bit more success here, right? Now, saloons is kind of an interesting thing because, first of all, between 1880 and 1900, the number of saloons in the United States had doubled, right? And a lot of it was driven by the amount of immigrants that had come in. There was a lot more demand. Americans were drinking about 1.2 billion gallons of beer per year by this time period, by 1900, compared to only about 590 million in 1885, right? But the reason why saloons popped up is that saloons had become focal points for the working class men, right? Especially amongst these immigrants, right? This was a place where it was like a Hull House in a way for them, right? It was a place where they could receive mail. if they didn't have a way to receive mail at their address. It was a way for them to get language lessons. It was a way for them to get a meal. You know, you come in there, you buy a beer, and typically you'd be given a free sandwich or something like that with it. Citizenship lessons, these kind of things I talked about. Hull House was often offered in these saloons. Okay, but of course the public motherhood movement saw these as the devil's workshop, right? Dens of evil. And in the case of alcohol, they are going to have some success against it, right? We're going to have the introduction and implementation of Prohibition, which we'll talk about in the 1920s lecture, since that's when it took place, right? You're going to have the implementation of Prohibition in 1900, and it'll last for about 13 years. But again, nothing real permanent. The third of these wars on vice is going to be the war against prostitution, the red light districts, right? With the advancement in knowledge of venereal diseases and how they're caused and where they come from, you're going to see the middle class become increasingly alarmed with the red light districts in major cities in the United States, right? Now, you are going to see some inroads in there. In many cities, you are going to see the red light districts get shut down. And in 1910, the Mann Act will outlaw the transportation of women across state lines for, quote, immoral purposes. Now, again, unintended consequences? Well, with this attack against prostitution, there certainly were some. And a lot of these cities had brothels that were run by a madam, right, in an environment that the women and the patrons were relatively safe, right? You're in this facility. Well, the elimination of that red light district didn't make prostitution just go away. Prostitution just moved onto the street, right, where the women involved in that were typically controlled by a pimp, right? And the conditions were a lot more dangerous, not just for the women, but for the patrons themselves. I'm not saying this as a promotion for legalized prostitution. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying, again, this is another example of the unintended consequences. The public motherhood movement felt if we get rid of the red light districts, prostitution goes away. Well, the result was profoundly different.